So welcome to everybody. I'm very glad that you managed to swim to the Institute. So we are very privileged. My name is Krastev. I'm one of the permanent fellows in the Institute. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the panel that you're going to listen to. Normally in the Institute, we are very kind of reluctant to present books. And we are almost never doing this. But on this occasion, we decided that it really makes sense because we're talking about a very important and interesting project that have been done with many people that know Institute for a long time, have been here, and intellectually we feel kind of connected to this. So we decided basically to break our tradition and to have a book being presented. I'm not specialist on regions at all, but I have noticed one thing. When people start talking regions, something is normally happening. Other empires are breaking down or new are being built. It's a project on European regions, on the multidisciplinary, multi-year project which Diana Mishkova and Bauer Strencheny has been doing, and they have been also the editors of the book. So what I'll do is basically give first them the floor to present the project, to present what they wanted to do, and then basically they'll give the floor to an outside reader and also to some of the major contributors, and then we're going to have time for discussion. So probably Diana.
Thank you to all of you for, Thank you to all of you for coming to talk with us. We thought of beginning with some very brief introduction. First, on the context, the background, the incentives behind the project we started back in 2012, and share with you a little bit about the kitchen about the joint work, the way we tried to converge our different methodologies and to tell you a little bit more about how we got to this product, the book that we present today. I think that there were basically two sets of incentives behind this project. The one was the sequel of the sequel of the political changes of 1989, which brought the disappearance of old and the emergence or re-emergence of new region. One may think as a good example here for the former of, let's say, Central Europe, which used to mesmerize the imagination of intellectuals and dissidents in the 1980s, only to all but disappear in about 10-15 years after 89, and now we are witnessing a dramatic comeback. Or we may think of the semantic changes that existing regionalizations underwent after 89, and here a good example among many could be the Baltic region or Pre-Baltica, which shifted meaning from a post-Soviet geopolitical space to one closely related to a new notion of the northern of Scandinavia, let's say. Something similar might be said about Eurasia, which evolved also in a very interesting way as a notion, as semantics, as compared to its 1920s predecessor. So that was one cluster of incentives. Another cluster were of epistemological nature. On the one hand, the powerful spatial turn in the social sciences, focusing on the social constructedness, the ideological underpinnings, the various ways of interpreting and representing space, and moving away from the container notion of space as predetermining, as it were, historical phenomena. And on the other hand, it was the aspiration to bring the methodological innovation of the spatial turn in the discussion of a trans-European conceptual history focused on the regional terminology and discourses. So in this way we came to the question, the main question of our project and the resulting volume. How were regions conceptualized over time, conceptualized and bordered over time by different disciplinary and academic cultures in different contexts and in different contexts and in different fields of activity. Consequently, the volume is structured in two parts. The first one deals with well-established regional notions such as Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Mediterranean, Southeastern Europe, Scandinavia, Northern Eurasia, Mediterranean, etc. And the second part deals with what we call disciplinary regionalizations, that is how different disciplines used to regionalize Europe, which means in a certain way how they actually define the analytical units of their analysis in this supranational mode. So obviously this was a very ambitious idea, very ambitious project, and the one adequate way we thought of tackling it, of addressing it, was via widely international and multidisciplinary collaborative research, which in this case was hosted by the Center for Advanced Study in Sofia and funded by the Stifterverband für die Deutsche Wissenschaft. Now, the research part of the project lasted for 2 years, between 2012 2014, but the actual work continued for as long as that, and even more. By the way, I was hesitant whether I should confess in front of this public how long it took to produce this book. Almost 6 years. If not for any other reason, because that may raise unduly the expectations from this volume. But while talking to one of our co-authors, Guido Francinetti, this morning, he pointed out, and I'm grateful for this recognition, that one of the strongest aspects of the project was the intensity of communication and the opportunity for the authors to come together and discuss and exchange approaches, to measure up their concepts and to compare their since we're talking largely of established scholars, of their preconceived notions, and to test them and probe them and so on. Something I hope Bolos will talk a little bit more in a few seconds. Because the idea, the aspiration behind this was to move away from the conventional type format of collective volumes, resulting usually by either commissioned papers or conferences, and create something much more coherent, symphonic, if you wish, as a volume, from which transpires a common understanding of what it takes to regionalize and what it takes to produce and to operate with regional terminology. I'm glad that so many good scholars agreed to participate in this project. It was a long but extremely illuminating and enriching experience for all of us. Now, Bolos, maybe you could.
So thanks first of all to IWM and to Ivan for hosting this event, and we very much hope that it will not be monological in any way. We try to create some sort of, if not symphony, but polyphony, at least with all the participants here, and we hope very much that the audience will also join the singing at some point. I mean, I would like to point out a couple of synergies and tensions that I think were very interesting in the process of doing this project. The first one is between Begriffsgeschichte or conceptual history and the spatial turn. Yes, I think that's very clear that in a way our starting point methodologically and intellectually was somehow bringing two things together which in themselves have a very strong intellectual tradition, but they were not really reacting to each other. Yes, I mean, conceptual history was very much about notions like folk, democracy, liberation, all this, and the spatial turn is obviously spatial, but the two didn't really have too much of a matrix. Almost the only example we could think of was the German conceptual historians making a project about French concepts of the French Revolution and having an entry about Bastille. That's almost the only conceptual history of spatial terms, and obviously that's a very different, it's kind of a lieu de mémoire more like than it's clearly not a region. So I mean, our idea was not only to actually develop a certain kind of conceptual history of regions, but try to this synergy of conceptual history and spatial terminology, and obviously that required rethinking both. Yes, rethinking both the ways we are historicizing spatial terms and also rethinking what we do when we are doing conceptual history. Now, the other thing I think which is interesting is that we were trying to generate this kind of interaction, which Diana was also talking about, but at the same time, I think we were trying to let the stories talk for themselves. So we were not trying to discipline, for example, not telling the temporal paradigm shifts, or we were not trying to project, let's say, Koselleck's Sattelzeit theory on the material that we had. We let everybody bring his own or her own temporal framework, and what, however, came out was that actually there is a very strong overlap, and that was, I think, very, very interesting experience, that we found out that there is some sort of pre-paradigmatic phase in the early 19th century. Somehow this whole regional conceptualization emerges somewhere in the early 19th century in the context of mainly German, but not only German, geographical thinking, but there it's barely political. Yes, I mean, these are basically scientific notions. Then there is some sort of politicization in the mid-19th century in the context of the redesigning of European empires, mainly the Habsburg, but also the Ottoman, and to a certain extent the Russian. But usually this is a politicization without the concept. Yes, I mean, like, we only retrospectively know that when they talk about the Habsburg monarchy, they were also talking about Central Europe. They didn't know they had this discussion without really the concept. And then somewhere in the late 19th century, these two things start to merge. And that is, of course, the moment when geography actually becomes a paradigmatic science of political thinking. This is the moment when geopolitics emerges as a kind of paradigm. And then this kind of matrix that emerges in the late 19th century will start to have a very interesting life. On the one hand, again, a kind of, if you want, second Sattelzeit in the early 20th century, a kind of new temporalization and ideologization of concepts connected to the collapse of liberal modernity or the shaking of liberal modernity in the early 20th century, especially in the context of the First World War and what happens after in the interwar period, and then a kind of new modernity or a new ambiguous modernity with the Marxist political language, which creates once again a kind of reconfiguration of these terms. Think about, for example, the disappearance of what Diana also mentioned, Central Europe, and the appearance of East and West as the key notions in the Cold War context, and then once again a paradigm shift somewhere in the 1970s, 1980s in the context of the collapse of this binary Cold War logic. So what we found is that these are strikingly actually overlapping stories, although of course some of the concepts and some of the notions have their own special life, but somehow it looks like that there is a kind of European story to tell. It was not just a kind of fragmented story. Now, two or three more interesting, let's say, synergies and tensions. I mean, one was between the disciplinary framing that Diana is also talking about. I think this was one of the innovative things that we tried to bring in contrast to the usual approach. Usual approach would be usually the biography of a regional term. Yes, there are monographs about almost all the chapters that we wrote. There is a monograph, there are at least 5 monographs about Central Europe, or even more, maybe hundreds about the Balkans, much less about Western Europe, obviously. I mean, like, West is much less central to the discussion, but obviously there are works about that as well. What is much less common is to bring this together with the mapping of how different disciplines are actually doing the regionalization. And I think if you could see the table of contents, maybe we will circulate the book as well, so for that, so that you can see, you will see that we try to put together also disciplines which are doing different kind of regionalization and try to see whether this disciplinary regionalization is telling us a kind of complementary story. And here it's an interesting gossip that I can share with you. What were the disciplines that couldn't produce such an overview? That was very interesting because we actually approached more scholars than the ones who made it into the volume, and it was very telling that 3 disciplines actually opted out, even though we commissioned more than one author from each of them, and that was political science, sociology, and anthropology. And this, I think, tells a lot why these 3 disciplines were actually not willing or not able to historicize themselves. I think in the case of anthropology, basically regionalizing Europe was refused by the anthropologists because they say that anthropology is a universal thing. Europe is not that interesting for us. I mean, we don't really have we can tell you how we regionalize Europe, but we don't know how we regionalized Europe. We don't have any kind of historical memory about this. Sociologists were basically not interested in historicizing their perspective, and political scientists, I think that was the funniest case. We actually contracted 3 different scholars in the process, and all of them believed that the task is to regionalize Europe. So they never understood that the task is not constructive but historical, yes, because for them there is only present. There is no past or in there. It was very, very interesting experience. And then on the other hand, so we had this disciplinary take, but at the same time we were quite aware of the fact that our interest is not only in the disciplinary narrative. So when we talk about Central Europe, it's not about only historians or, I don't know, social demographers or literary historians. Is also about the public sphere, yes? And I mean, what we try to achieve in these short chapters that we wrote is to somehow bring together the public discourse and the disciplinary discourse. And I think what we found, and I think this is also methodologically interesting, is that in the 19th century, the kind of disciplinary discourse is shaping to a certain extent the public discourse, maybe up to the interwar period, and then somehow it changes the other way around, that the intellectuals have to take into account that there is also a public discourse about these notions. And I mean, think about Central Europe. Yes, I mean, Central Europe was a public discourse much more than a scholarly discourse in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, people read Kundera and then read Jenő Szűcs. Yes, I mean, it was not Jenő Szűcs who convinced Kundera to write something about Central Europe. So that was also very interesting experience. And then 2 more quick remarks. I mean, one about the meso-regions, yes, because we are talking, I mean, we call this European regions and boundaries, but you can easily raise the question that there are different kind of regions. I mean, Europe itself is a region, and also Transylvania is a region, or Silesia is a region, yes. So what we talk about in this volume is the meso-regions, and we took this notion partially from Stefan Tröps, but there are some other people who use it this way. But we were quite aware of the fact that the intellectual and, let's say, conceptual operations using, let's say, sub-national regions are very often very similar to these meso-regions, yes? So, I mean, regionalizing can be quite similar when we talk about supranational regions and sub-national regions. But nevertheless, we thought that in this project we are focusing on the meso-regions, and I think there were some obvious reasons for it. They are inheritors of the imperial heritages differently than the subnational regions. The subnational regions are also inheritors of imperial heritages, but they function differently. And then I think what is also important here is the very interesting dialectic between national discourses and regional discourses. Yes, so I think you can, looking at Central Europe or Balkans or any other Eurasia, any other region, you can see very interesting dynamics. National projects are regionalizing themselves and regional projects are nationalizing themselves. Yes? So very often you find nationalist projects which are kind of trying to extrapolate their national agenda into regional discourses. Look at Hungary now with the new Central Europe of Orbán, and very often you have the other way around, that regionalist discourses are starting to behave as if they were national discourses. They try to set up borders, they try to set up maybe even armies for certain regional projects, and so on and so on. So I think that was also very interestingly common. And I think the last thing I would like to mention is that, of course, it was a work in progress until the very last moment. And I think we were quite, I mean, I don't want to claim any prophetic capacity, but I think we were quite sensitive to the fact that the whole paradigm was exactly shifting in the very moment when we were actually finishing this book. So we were identifying, of course, the demise of the Central European discourse in the 1990s, then the kind of reinvention of North and South, a kind of residual East and West, yes, I mean Eastern European accession countries versus Western European core, then all of a sudden with the European crisis of 2008, 2009, a kind of North-South axis coming back, all of a sudden Poland and Germany and Sweden are in one context, Greece, Italy and Spain in the other, like the pigs and all these concepts emerging. And then we also identified, I think, in the very end of our project that the kind of new East-West was re-emerging in the context of the migration, framing of the migration and all that. And I think our conclusion from this was not to universalize any of these discourses, but to show how constructed and how moving these concepts are and how political they are, yes, that rather than, and I think this was our polemic, of course, against the virtual and real political scientists who were telling us that they can tell us where Central Europe is. We were trying to tell them that you only tell where Central Europe is from a certain political and disciplinary perspective. There is no Central Europe, there is no Eastern Europe. I mean, you only have projects to kind of fix the meaning of these absolutely kind of flying notions. And I think that is probably, if there is any kind of moral and political and intellectual conclusion from our project, is that these are highly contingent notions, but at the same time they are not completely haphazard. Yes, I mean they are all work with existing cultural, ideological, intellectual resources. And if you do it historically, as we try to do, then you can actually identify these components from which these projects are built. It's not by chance that Orbán started with a new anti-liberal Central European discourse. It's surprising for us because we somehow believe that the Central Europe discourse is a liberal intellectual tradition, but if you scratch it better, then you will see also an anti-liberal intellectual tradition competing with the liberal Central Europe as well. So these available ideological fragments can be reactivated and reconfigured. So I would like to now ask the person whom we asked to actually give an external reading to us, Ulf Brunnbauer, who is a professor in Regensburg at the Leibniz Institute for Eastern European Studies and a very long-term friend of most of the people who have been contributing to this volume, and I think one of the real big authorities on how the Balkans and Central Europe and Eastern Europe have been framed in different cultural and political and disciplinary contexts, and we are very much looking forward to his reading, and then we will ask also the other contributors who are here in the room, like 5 of them, to react to it. We will be silent with Diana, and then we will kindly ask the audience if they have questions and suggestions to join the discussion. So now I would like to invite Ulf, and we are very grateful that you made it from Regensburg. Even if the train was very...
Even that Deutsche Bahn tried hard not to bring me to Regensburg, but I managed. Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. That I'm not so sure whether I deserve the praise in these warm words. I consider myself more a down-to-earth social historian. I'm certainly not an intellectual historian, and neither am I really very much into conceptual history. So maybe you should take my remarks as the way how a non-intellectual historian reads a book like this. The task for now has become even more difficult because I can only agree with what the editors said. So I don't know who in the audience has already read this book, but everything that Diana and Balázs said is true. It's really an excellent exercise of a very coherent and consistent conceptual history, which takes a very nominalist approach to the question how Europe is regionalized and how different concepts of European regions have been used and misused. Maybe I should also start with a disclaimer. At the end, a discussion about how we can talk about different regions of Europe and how these concepts were formed. At the end, such discussions very often end at the point where people say, okay, we have now done all these nice deconstructivist exercises, we have looked into the problematic conceptual, intellectual trajectories of these regions. Of course, we agree that there's nothing like an essence of a region, but still, are they real? And in such debates, I would always side with the essentialists, although I know that's the intellectually not very up-to-date position, but as someone holding a chair in Southeastern European history and being director of an Institute of East and Southeast European history, I need to believe that there is something like Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, otherwise I would be unemployed. I think I even prepared some slides, if Anna can, is it this? Ah, okay, perfect. So intellectuals like all of you probably don't watch the Eurovision or would not admit to watching it. It's like that many intellectuals don't admit to watch football. But you might be aware that a couple of days ago Eurovision Song Contest took place in Lisbon, and this brouhaha of cheesy music and even more ridiculous costumes. I think it's a nice starting point to discuss about whether there is something like a reality of regions in Europe, whether regions solicit, or the idea of regions solicits some sort of feelings, of sentiments, of commonality, of solidarity, and whether we can measure that. As a social historian, I believe only in things that we can somehow measure. And a couple of months ago, 3 researchers from the US published a paper where they actually analyzed the voting behavior of the European audiences. For those of you who are not so familiar with this very funny exercise in bad music, since 1997, it's not only expert juries that decide. As an Austrian, I must say, I really regret this, because if it was up to the experts, we would have won this time. But it's also the audience, the popular audience, which also has a vote. And so these researchers calculated the voting patterns, how points are allocated. And what they found out is that there are some blocks, voting blocks, and they could identify 3 ones. A Nordic bloc, a sort of post-Soviet, and the Balkan bloc. So interestingly, adjacent regions at the fringes of what we usually consider Europe. There's nothing like a Southern European or a Romance bloc or a West European bloc. They're the big 5s, Germany, Spain, France, UK, and Italy, who are always qualified, and they don't vote for each other, which is one reason why they never win. But obviously, the Eastern Europeans, the Scandinavians, and also the Southeast Europeans do share some sympathy when it comes to bad music, at least. So this volume comes, and this was already said, I think, at the right time for a couple of reasons. First of all, what we do see, and it was already alluded to by the editors, is a sort of comeback of geopolitics, not only as a political practice, but also as a political ideology, and also as a way how global and international politics is analyzed by political science. And obviously we cannot talk about geopolitics without having also regions, which in a way form the conceptual base, but very often also the policy-making reality of international politics. It's also topical, the book, or very current and up-to-date in order to reflect about the new articulations of divisions in Europe. Obviously, we cannot ignore that there are some real divisions in Europe, although they are usually framed in a way that actually the real divisions, the real equalities are more hidden than revealed. Balázs already mentioned the problematic, but also very interesting trajectory of the concept of Central Europe, which I think illustrates nicely not only why the book is so important, but also what the book is about. Talking about Central Europe in this room is probably a little bit redundant at an institution that's coming out very much from this very liberal utopia that was less than 40 years ago associated with the idea of Central Europe, a liberal utopia that turned into an invective, basically, a swear word. Which also sort of nicely shows that certain concepts of regions, and I think Central Europe is a very good example of that, and I will come back to this later, certain concepts become very thick. But it doesn't mean that the meaning remains unchanged. The meaning is still very versatile, but obviously some regional concepts and some others not, and this book really shows this very clearly. Some regional concepts are obviously, and the question is why, more liable to be overdetermined by political and also other ascriptions of meaning. And Central Europe is certainly prime example. What Central Europe, by the way, and this is one of the points where Balázs is not right. He wrote in his chapter, he wrote the chapter about Central Europe, which is an excellent exercise, as you can imagine, but it was written a couple of years ago. And he wrote that there's no consensus of who is in and who is out. Probably this needs to be qualified today, because there is now a clear consensus emerging in Central Europe who is out, at least, and probably not who is in, but who is out, or who is really very much out. And Central Europe is a good example for one of the interesting aspects of the book, and I think all chapters, although we just heard there was not really an assignment of what authors had to deal with, but in a way all approach the subject, especially those chapters that really deal with these names of regions, in a similar way. They are showing, they are revealing that when talking about European regions, meso-regions, we are shooting at moving targets. And each individual chapter shows how these targets move and why they moved. And for Central Europe, of course, this has also already been shown by geographers who presented the very different ways how Central Europe was put on a map, which also makes you a bit skeptical about the wisdom of geographers. But anyway, obviously, even Central Europe, which has such a thick thick meaning, is something that is very hard to pin down on a map. And depending on the point of view of the observer, depending on the time, depending on the political context, depending on the situation. So if I were an anthropologist of the Manchester School of Social Anthropology, I would say, okay, this we need to interpret from a situationalist point of view, very much also pertaining to Central Europe. It moves. We cannot say where it is. And you might think that, okay, at least institutions might provide some stability to concepts. Not very many regions turn into institutions that bear the name of the region. There's no Iberian Council. There used to be a Western European Union, which has now been dissolved, but basically for all its existence, it was completely not known. I think it actually mobilized as an institution only once. There's a Central European Free Trade Agreement, and again, it shows nicely how regions move. Nowadays, this one institution, a real institution, which does something, there's a certain practice, there are institutional arrangements, there are members who claim to be part of this Central European institution, now consists of countries that you usually probably would not consider part of Central Europe, like the Republic of Moldova, Albania, Macedonia, but the Western Balkans, actually, but in a way, at least the Western Balkans maybe are nowadays more liberal than Central Europe, so they can take some credibility. The book is a very, it is a really very consistent conceptual history. So those of you who want to learn something about the history of Western Europe, Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, should not turn to this book. But that's not the purpose of the book. And I think with the exception of one author, and his name will not be disclosed, I assume he is not here, actually all authors also subscribe to this consistent, coherent, conceptual approach, where the history of concepts, the history of names, and their uses, there are also business cycles, if you want, is discussed, but not the reality behind it. Still, I think the authors were also driven by the belief, and they would completely agree with them, that at least some of these concepts also have social relevance. Not only for intellectuals, and these are usually very few, but also in a way that they might provide also a form of or a locus of identity. And I also think, and this was already stressed by the two editors, why this book is still so important, also from an epistemological point of view. We probably all would agree that history takes place, that society takes place, and we use this phrase, an event takes place, very much without really thinking about what does place mean in this context. Where does history really take place? Today it almost seems sort of redundant and anachronistic to not write and frame history in a transnational way, history as something where areas are entangled, history and also sociology, which we should not write only in the frame of a national state. But if you look in the historiographic practice or the practice of sociology, this is still very much the framework that provides the space where most of history, as it is written by historians, and sociology, as it is written by sociologists, take place. So I think it's still very useful to look at these regional concepts as a way to, although that's not the primary purpose of the book, at least not of the text, maybe it's sort of more the hidden agenda, in how far these concepts can help us to find a way to write history in different spatial and more open, more flexible spatial frameworks that overcome the what was called methodological nationalism. One of the most interesting and I think most important, and that's probably one of the few points where I would dare articulate some critique, or some criticism. One of the most interesting things of this book, and this was also really very new for me. Obviously, I've read a lot about the conceptual history of Southeastern Europe, of the Balkans, of Eastern Europe. That's professional sort of obligation to do. But these chapters on Iberia, Nordic countries, Western Europe, that really also provided a lot of new information. What was really striking is actually that none of these other concepts ever got the same traction as Central Europe, Balkans, or Southeastern Europe, or Eastern Europe. And I think this is something where we really need to think about why. And here I think the book doesn't really provide an answer. I mean, there are some glimpses, because in a way you provide sort of a toolkit. What is necessary, what is required to build a successful regional concept, and why other concepts are not so successful. Obviously, measuring success is also pretty difficult in this regard. You could probably argue that some of these concepts became very successful in terms of their intellectual attraction, in terms also of their appeal to very different political sort of attributions of meaning, also attempts to appropriate these concepts for certain policies. What I'm talking about Central Europe today is an obvious example. Some other regional concepts, which are also not discussed in the book, don't carry much sort of mythological meaning, but maybe are politically much more important, or are much more important in real life. I'm thinking, for example, of Benelux, which is not discussed, which is probably the most successful regional concept in Europe, and maybe it is successful because it's not really related. I mean, there's some foundational myth, there's some idea of obviously cultural closeness and proximity of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Although if you go to these countries, then people probably would not feel so articulate. It's a completely different feeling. But it's politically very successful. It's economically very successful. It's one of the few regions that really exist as a region in institutional terms with a high degree of interaction in all kinds of fields. The Balkans is much more colorful, but in terms of its political importance, it always remained important. And Central Europe, basically, as well, in institutional terms. This book is an analysis, as I said, as the editor said, in conceptual history. So it's basically discourse analysis that is provided. And as a social historian, I'm always very reluctant to accept if historians or other thinkers write about discourses, present sort of examples, articulations of certain ideas, because basically so much has been published that you could provide examples for almost every, even the most crazy idea, and present it in a coherent way so that a nice narrative emerges. So I need data. And the data that prove that these regional concepts have very different in themselves, but also different to each other cycles of use. There's a very nice tool created by Google, probably you know that, the Ngram viewer, which is basically not much more than a tool that counts the frequency of words in all books that Google has already digitized, which is, when it comes to English language literature, basically most of the literature that has been published since 1800. And if you do a search using the concepts as they are discussed in the book, then you will see that by far Eastern and Western Europe, they are leading, and then Balkans. So these are obviously concepts that found some traction. There are some cycles. It's not a uniform curve, but there are some other concepts: the Baltic, the Mediterranean, Southern Europe, Iberia, which obviously never really became very important, and especially not in those regions that are described by this name. This comes very clearly out, for example, in the chapter on Iberia, that there might be people doing some sort of Iberian studies or Iberian history, but they are not coming from the Iberian Peninsula. So your authors were fully right, and it's also now there's proved by hard science fact that not all regional concepts enjoy the same traction in the public, and are not liable to becoming overdetermined by political meaning, by all sorts of cultural ascriptions in to the same extent. And obviously the question is why. Some more numbers. It is also, I think, quite actually interesting, and it runs a little bit against the hope that such regions would provide us with a more popular framework to write history. If you look how many histories of these regions have been written with such a name, it's very few. So obviously still the paramount subject of history is a state, but not a meso region. Okay, some questions. So it's not really criticism, rather like, well, okay, where to go forward. I think one thing which the book helps us to understand, although it doesn't explain it explicitly, is why thinking about regions, about meso-regions, is so popular in East Central Europe and also in the German academia. The German academia is probably also related to this tendency of German academics to come up with Aristotelian definitions. So if they talk about Central Europe or East Central Europe, there must be a clear cluster of criteria that makes this region region. It's also not, I think, not by chance that two authors from East Central Europe, or how you would ever call it, editors, were behind this project, and not someone from Ireland and from Portugal or Iberia. And I think this helps also to understand what you need to build a successful regional concept. Obviously, it helps to be situated in a post-imperial or late imperial situation. It also helps if you are part of a political or intellectual elite that feels hegemonized by foreign big power, be it an imperial capital or being a foreign power like the Soviet Union, Russia, which was in a way not foreign in this discourse of Central Europe subjected to Soviet rule. It's probably also helpful if you are situated in a region which is characterized politically by small states. So this sort of thinking in terms of region seems to be a small state phenomena. It's part of, well, the history of small states in East Central Europe. Not only in terms of self-articulation, but also in terms of external recognition. The regional concepts also seem to gain traction in external contexts if small regions seem to be too complicated, where you cannot really tell apart the constitutive parts. Let me end with well, and obviously from that point of view, you could have included many other regions. So maybe you do a second volume with regional concept like the Alps, for example. But that's something. But let me conclude with a remark on the consequences of such an exercise in conceptual history for the epistemology, how we should write history. The editors, and probably deliberately so, did not provide any definition of what the meso-region is. And I'm still, of course, I've also read this text by Stefan Droebst and other colleagues from Germany mainly. I'm still not very much convinced that it really makes sense as a category of analysis. What you do is using these terms as a category of description, basically, descriptive categories, and you show their history. But I think you also imply that they could also be used, if we are aware of this history, that they could also be used as an analytical category. And I'm still not so sure. I fully agree with all of you who want to provide a new spatial framework how we write history, and I also think that these supranational frameworks are more productive than the national ones, but they also come with certain disadvantages. They also can turn into a kind of a container where you let history stop at a certain boundary, and there's boundaries in the title, although the social action doesn't stop there. So I do think that actually we should really try to think space in a way that it is not that it is not related to boundaries, at least not boundaries in this at the end still very spatial way, but rather think about space in terms of spaces of communication, spaces of interaction where social boundaries become much more important. And this is, by the way, and this is my last comment, what I also found so refreshing in your book, that you tried to include, and successfully did with some, not with all, disciplinary perspectives, where when looking at Attila Melik, for example, talks about demography, where actually social boundaries or social the facts are much more important for the conceptualization of regions. So I think thinking about regions and about boundaries does help us to rethink the way we write history, but I think we also should go a step forward and not stop at rewriting the history of Europe in its meso regions, but really look where the social action is. Thank you. By the way, maybe a last thing, because Diane already spoke about the kitchen. This is also a way how we could regionalize Europe. And as someone being also an immigrant myself, Austrian living in Germany, I can tell you that actually culinary boundaries, I think, are some of the most important ones.
Thank you very much, Ulf. I mean, as a matter of fact, your talk could have just as well been incorporated as a thoughtful epilogue to our volume. So thank you very much indeed. I hope that we'll have the time and the enthusiasm to respond to some of the comments made by Ulf. But before that, let me give the floor to some of the authors. First is Mark Basin, who is from the Geographical Craft, but in this volume he participates with a chapter on Eurasia, a topic he's been working on for some time. Mark comes from the University of Södertörn Södertörn University in Sweden.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting, slightly out of the discipline perspective, looking in from outside. So that's been very stimulating for us. We'll think about it. And I want to begin by picking up one thing that you began with, and this was your consternation about, you called yourself an essentialist. And the notion of are regions objective or are they kind of constructed? And I was thinking, and I realized that for my chapter, I think my chapter on Eurasia was distinctive among all of them because it's about a continent. I don't think any of them, they're all about meso-regions, which are continental, they're parts of different parts of the continent, but in this case it's an actual continent itself. And that means it's on the map, it's distinguished by being surrounded by water, and it is indeed there. But even the fact that it's a continent, a piece of rock sort of that you can see and touch, there are still disagreements about where it is and what the boundaries are. So the constructed nature, the invented nature of it, it seems to me doesn't go away. And for me, the interest was really in looking at the ways in which the different significances it's had, the different valorizations that this has had. And if I just go quickly maybe through the story. The other point that I want to make, and actually this is how I want to talk about it just for a few minutes here, is picking up on what Balázs said, this tension between the meso-regional, which are the chapter organizations, or the continental in my case, and the national, because this is really fundamental, and certainly for the story I try to tell in my chapter, it's all about that. So I guess one more distinctive element, I think, in what I did is that it's very recent. That is, Eurasia, Europe, and Asia, of course, go back to the Greeks. Eurasia, as such, which is built from those two concepts, is really begins in the earlier, sort of almost mid-19th century, and has kind of developed since then. It was first discovered or first theorized by out of natural science by geologists, actually, earth scientists, plate tectonic studies, who, looking at the globe, realized that although for centuries the teachings had been a division between Europe and Asia, that there was in geography, there was in actual sort of physical fact, no division between Europe and Asia. There is no continental division. If you kind of look at the map and can get the cultural distinction out of your head, you'll see there is no distinction. This was the beginning of plate tectonics. So it began as a natural science idea, and then you can just follow it through different countries and seeing how they react to it and how it gets picked up on in different countries, and this is the story of the development. And it first gets picked up on by Russian nationalists, Pan-Slavs, in the middle of the 19th century, who were also natural scientists. They were aware of these geological discussions, but they saw Eurasia as providing two different things for their particular sort of project of building a movement of Russian nationalism. On the one hand, they believed it diminished Europe, because Europe was no longer a self-standing entity, and actually geologically it was more of a periphery and a peninsula, actually, of the Eurasian continent. They liked that very much. They felt that sort of that helped them in their own sort of struggle against this dominant European presence. On the other hand, they liked the idea of Eurasia. And Eurasia could be very helpful, but they didn't take, and here you go, they didn't take the continent in its entirety of Europe plus Asia, which is what Eurasia is actually. But they said, no, it's neither Europe nor Asia, or it's Europe plus Asia in a particular way, but a third entity, which doesn't subsume the other two but exists separately, and this, of course, unsurprisingly, was the Russian Empire. And this but they then began to think of this as a third continent, a Eurasian. Eventually, in the 1920s, this was given a name of Evrazia, or Eurasia, and this became a very important nationalist movement, which has made its reappearance today. So in Russia, then, it emerges as a discourse about a sort of subcontinental entity, which has this name Eurasia. In the after the turn of the century, then, with the development of geopolitics in the West, and in particular in the United Kingdom, in Britain, people now defenders of British sort of maritime dominance, global dominance, also began to theorize Eurasia. This began to seem interesting to them, but they saw it in a much more, in the original sense of it being Europe plus Asia, this one continent, and in particular the geographer Alfred Mackinder, who some of you may know about, came up with a theory which has become very famous, and in a way it's probably the most effective and influential geopolitical theory that we've had in the 20th and now even into the 21st century. And this is a notion of Eurasia, which he called it Eurasia, but he also called it the world island. This combined entity of Europe and Asia could come under the domination of one or a number of countries. And if it came under the control of one or another countries, it could rule the world. And he actually made this argument. It was taken very seriously. And in fact, in the aftermath of World War I, he restated it. And this was one of the sort of movements toward a cordon sanitaire, a string of nation states that was set up between Germany and the Soviet Union to prevent the emergence of a consolidation across the Eurasian continent. A few decades later, the scene of this type of thinking shifts to Germany, where National Socialism is in power. And again, the geopoliticians, in particular Karl Haushofer, very, very influenced by Mackinder, very much an acolyte in a sense, and a follower of Mackinder. But of course, he reversed the prescription. Rather than saying we had to keep Germany and the Soviet Union separate, Mackinder said, no, there has to be precisely what Mackinder said, precisely what Mackinder said, a Eurasian continental bloc, and then this would be the basis for global dominance. And so this, of course, was the idea, and then this came to fruition briefly, 2 years, in 1939, through the agreement, and then they prophesized that this then would be the union that would bring about this type of domination. This, of course, didn't last. The idea of Eurasia then moved to the United States, and without going into the very complicated ways in which this Eurasian type of thinking and mythology was taken up, it eventually turned out to be the basis for what was the post-war policy for many decades of the West against the Soviet Union, and this, of course, was the policy of containment, which is a slight alteration of Mackinder, but very much based on this idea, very much based on the prospect of Eurasian domination, a domination of one country across the Eurasian continent, and what that could mean globally, and the determination to prevent that. So this then began to fall apart, of course, after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, but precisely as this began to fall apart in the West, the Soviet Union collapsed, and now the idea of Eurasia came back in a very big way to Russia, where it hadn't been, of course, for the life of the Soviet Union. But it came back in a big way because a new concept was needed to give some sort of coherence to this post-Soviet space. And one could no longer talk about the Soviet Union, but one also no longer wanted to necessarily pursue the nation-state dynamic that had been unleashed in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And Eurasia was a very convenient way to do that. But it was different. It didn't come back in the same way. Because rather than being a dominant discourse of Russian nationalism, which it had been before, it came back as that as well, but also other parts of the Soviet Union, in particular Central Asia, and the Central Asian countries, which now understood Eurasia in a third way, perhaps, or a fourth way, in terms of their own identity and their own special Central Asian blend of European, in this case Russian, influences and influences from the East. So in a way, the Eurasian doctrine post-Soviet was born in Central Asia and then has grown. Now it was finally embraced officially, of course, now when we have a Eurasian even a Eurasian Union, economic union, that's been established in 2015, which is a kind of parallel, which isn't very much intentionally a parallel to the European Union. You have this, and again, Eurasia being a part of the Eurasian, this Eurasia is only one sort of center, core of the large Eurasian continent. Of course, and the final point that I'll mention is that of China, which now also is embracing its own Eurasian vision. And this is a very interesting one because it is the continental, the genuine continental Europe plus Asia vision, but even broader than that, as far as I understand it. Even has ambitions, it sort of focuses on that, but even has greater ambitions. So again, with respect to our commentator, who I think made very important points, but there is an interpretive element to this. There is a subjective, affective element, I think, to these concepts, and at least for me, and I think for most of the contributors also, it was looking at these significations, these interpretations, this invention that was the important and informative element. So thank you.
Let me ask Pertel Pirimäe from Estonia, from the University of Tartu, to talk a little bit about his chapter and the whole, I think here it is blood sausage, but he will not talk about blood sausage, but rather about Baltic understanding of space and historical region.
Thank you very much. No, actually, I think I should talk about blood sausages, because as you can see, the blood sausage region only extends to Estonia and Latvia, but not Lithuania. And no Estonian would ever touch the goose blood soup that Lithuanians eat. But this really illustrates the way the regions are actually constructed. So when we look at this dilemma of construction, essentialism, then obviously the Baltics or the Baltic states is on that scale where the constructed nature is very strong. So there is no obvious geographical reason why this eastern part of the Baltic coast should be signified as a distinct region. So it has just strong historical, cultural, political, and ideological reasons. And this is the story that I tell in my chapter, how this notion, the Baltic, was invented and how it transformed. And indeed, the transformations were very large. On the one hand, the essence or the content of what the Baltics meant was differed very strongly from the 19th to the 20th century. When you look at how it was first invented in the early 19th century, then it signified the German-dominated provinces of the Russian Tsarist Empire, which coincides with this blood sausage land, the three provinces of Estland, Livland, and Kulland. And by the time of after the First World War, it had become the region consisting of three independent nation states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So when nowadays we have the book about the history of the Baltic states that extends back to the Middle Ages or the even before that, then it's of course very strongly anachronistic. So when we speak of the history of the Baltics, then essentially you can only talk about the history of the conceptualization of the Baltics. And in a way, we know the region today, there's really the most decisive moment was the Soviet occupation, when the three countries were simultaneously occupied and became known as the Soviet Pribaltica. So it's also maybe ironic that it became a meso-region, not as a supranational region, but as a subnational unit in a larger empire. So this entire constructivist story is one part. What is actually interesting at the same time is the remarkable stability that this kind of construction can hold. When you think of so many attempts of trying to get rid of the Baltics, to move away from the Baltics, to signify for example, Estonians, they have said we are not a Baltic nation, we speak a different language, we are Finno-Ugric, or we are Nordic. And similar attempts by Lithuanians to belong into Central Europe, then it really shows the stability and the constraints on this kind of region work or conscious region work, and also shifts our attention to this external labeling and internal project work. That, as also the commentator very aptly said, that it's largely also just a matter of convenience for the outside observers to use the old labels and not to take so great interest in this details and the actual differences within the region. So this is what I tried to tell, the story I tried to tell in my chapter. Thank you.
And now I'll give the floor to Vasu Sirenidou, who is from the History Department of the Athens University, who participated in the volume with another salient region, the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My preoccupation with the Mediterranean, the conceptual history of the Mediterranean, was a byproduct of my preoccupation with the regional context of the Greek history. The Balkans and the Mediterranean are they coexist as a regional context, although they are characterized by bipolic oppositions: mountain, sea, dark, brightness, fragmentation, connectiveness. So I was quite familiar with this region, which was a rich pool of metaphors and meanings. In my chapter, I followed the transformation of a sea with multiple names and without a unifying regional conceptualization during the Antiquity and the Middle Ages into a geographical region, a climatic zone, a geopolitical space, a historical agent, a cultural area. So, why the Mediterranean, and why the Mediterranean now? So, what I keep from this mental, let's say, trip to this with my participation in this chapter? I think there are three things. The first is that although our focus was on academic conceptualization of regions, I think that the case of the Mediterranean illustrates how academic concepts are related with popular and mass culture, and how the market contributes to the transformation of space and time into meaningful regional concepts. Since the 60s, it is the most powerful meanings and concepts of the Mediterranean are those connected to the sea, and is this that the Club Med that transformed this Brodelian immobility into a sense of out-of-time temporality. I think that Mediterranean, in the case of the Mediterranean, is the mass culture that gives the tone to its conception as a region. The second point that makes the Mediterranean an interesting point, I think, is its effectiveness to serve as a pool of positive alternative identities. Since the 90s, the Mediterranean has been experiencing great popularity, both in academic milieu and in identity politics. And it would be interesting in your, Ulf, you show us this table with the history of Mediterranean. I'm sure that the appearance of this phrase, it's after 90s, because we have a multiplication of journals, of conferences. So Mediterranean, in their search for alternative, for no rigid, let's say, categories, I think historians, the Mediterranean paradigms was served as alternative, were very attractive. And I think that what is also interesting is the role of the Mediterranean in the identity politics. it's Mediterranean's conceptual positioning between the global, the national and the global, renders it to a pool of alternative identities, and this success lies in its effectiveness to join existing nodes of identities without threatening them, their legitimacy, or replacing them. So is quite flexible to serve as in identity politics. And the third point is that I think is make this paradigm the case of Mediterranean interesting, is the current instrumentalization of its past in the frame of in the context of the EU policy, in its idealized form as a forerunner of the capitalist globalization, as the sea of a free trade and connectiveness, but at the same time, and now the ongoing refugee crisis, again, for another time, as the border, the frontier, the Europe's frontier against the Muslim invasion. So this was, I think, makes these 3 points, I think, made the significance of this, of Mediterranean, they illustrate the significance of the Mediterranean, the conceptual history of the Mediterranean, and I think that that was my contribution to illustrate these points in this volume. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasu. And now the next contributor that I'll give the floor to is Guido Francinetti from the University of Alessandria in Italy, whose chapter is an exception among the others. I mean, Vasu's as well, because Vasu's chapter, this is what we were talking with Bolos while she was presenting it, is one of the few cases where the politicization of the region was not important for its conceptualization, or not as important as in the other cases, but its metaphorical, historic weight and burden was much more important in this sense. But in Guido's case, it's another exception in the sense that one can, his chapter is on Southern Europe. That was the region that kind of never was. In other words, it's the opposite of our historical regions, because it arguably had all the preconditions to become a region, but never became one. So, Guido.
Thank you. I'm a minimalist, so I really will try to keep it short. I just want to make 5 simple points. As Mishka has said, Southern Europe is a non-concept. It's a dog which never barked. I sometimes had difficulty in convincing colleagues about this, but thanks to our commentator, I now have hard evidence. I have achieved nul point, to use the language of Jeux sans frontières. There were no cases of histories of Southern Europe. Although from a factual point of view, I must point out that there has been one written, interestingly enough, by the mentor of Mr. Salvini, the head of the Lega, who was about to become prime minister but has not made it. But anyway, the basic point is that there is nothing, that Southern Europe has never taken off as a concept and as a label. Why is this? Well, I don't want to go through all the points which can be found in the article. Let's say the first stage is with Montesquieu, with the use of climate theory to try and explain the differences between North and South of Europe, which of course has echoes the Protestant and Catholic divide of Europe. It also reflects other factors such as the loss of importance of the Mediterranean vis-a-vis the Atlantic, and so forth. It should be pointed out that whilst Montesquieu's theory is criticized, it's actually the beginning, or an instance of actually trying to do social science. It's trying to put 2 factors into contact. In the 19th century, even the emergence of a nation state such as Italy actually acted against the idea of conceptualizing Southern Europe. And no less importantly, there is the fact that France, which was the nation state par excellence, never really came to terms with the fact of being Southern European or not being it. France maintained a sort of ambiguous position. And then finally, even in the phase of colonial and imperial expansion, again, this acted against the idea of South, because, of course, from the Italian point of view, the prospect was of imperial expansion in the Mare Nostrum, or even when they did think of the South, they thought of the south of the Mediterranean, or even further. They didn't think of the South as being the south of Europe. So I just want to make two last points. Miskova, in her chapter on the Balkans, makes the point that the political Balkans seem to have gone, but the cultural Balkans are still with us. And I'd like to sort of say by analogy that the political economic Southern Europe has not really emerged, has not really taken off. Yes, I'm perfectly aware of the PIGS label, but if you look at the PIGS label, it's Portugal, which has sort of left the category. You had Ireland in the first stage, Italy, which is sort of still there. But I mean, if you look at it at the distance of a few years, you will see that it hasn't really stuck as a category. On the other hand, by analogy with the Balkans, I could say that the culture of Southern Europe is still with us. And a brilliant example is Agambin's theorization of the Southern model, which I could translate as sort of siesta socialism, in the sense that, the model which Southern Europe must offer is siesta, nice life, nice food, etc., which perhaps social historians might have reservations about. But anyway, and apparently, actually, the Agambin's article has been quite successful even in Germany, or perhaps especially in Germany. But to take up our commentator's point about let's give some hard facts, I think actually there is a very good example of the way we can measure these things in terms of social facts, and that is the Southern European welfare model. If we take the conceptualization which Ferreira and Martin Rhodes offered at the middle of the 90s, you have a perfect prophecy of what happened. So, as you see, concepts can be useful even when they're not totally successful. So the moral of the story is, read Ferreira, don't read Agambin, or read it if you want to have fun. Thank you.
And now the last item on our appetizing menu is the chapter that is a disciplinary chapter by Attila Meleg from Corvinus University Budapest, and this is about demography, and you will see how something that you would not presume to be actually par excellence, regionalizing scientific approach is actually one of the core frameworks where this regionalizing discourse is actually taking place.
Thank you very much. I take the question of Brunnbauer to have an idea why certain regions are becoming important. And I am going to give you a personal comment, reflection. I'm not going to tell the chapter. A personal reflection and a political one, right? The personal one was the following. How I got into this business of regions was the following. I was very much interested in social history, and I was very much interested in family history. And all of a sudden, a professor of mine came up to me and told me that there was a new source, a new enumeration on Neustift, one of the districts of Buda, and then I should work on it. Of course, it was completely strange for me because it was in German, Gothic German, and I was reading all these kind of enumerations one by one. At the same time, I went to my supervisor, who was Rudolf Andorka, a very famous Hungarian sociologist and demographer, and then I asked Professor Andorka, could you tell me what I should focus on? Because, it's a very complicated, and then I started explaining all kinds of nonsense to him. And then he looked at me very deeply into the eyes. Look, Attila, the most important thing that you decide whether this household formation is an Eastern type or a Western type. Now with this, he ruined my thesis completely, I can tell you, because I wanted to make sense of this question, which made no sense to me, because I was basically interested in how those craftsmen were living and what kind of a house were they doing. And then all of a sudden I had to figure it out, whether they were an Eastern type or a Western type thing. And that was the first moment when I got into this business of regions, right? And the second is a political one, which shows that I cannot get out of this business anymore. And that's because, once again, it's because of demography. That at the end of the chapter, I was also writing, actually as early as 2014, that, you know, up till the early 2000s, the regional understanding in demography was about, you know, classifying various parts of Europe on the basis of differential fertility or family formation. Who was marrying early? Who was marrying late, who was having more children, less children, what was the dynamic of that? Of course, all these things are not that important. You know, fertility is very low everywhere, so basically it makes no sense to work on differential fertility too hard. There are people who are working on this, don't worry, but I don't regard this as very, very important. But then I was writing that migration is going to be the new concept. And I was not sure that it would blow up immediately, because that was in 2014. And then we could see that all of a sudden migration has become a factor, and attitudes toward migration has become a factor which recreates new regions, or recreates old new regions, which became very powerful historical political blocks now within the European Union. And then here comes one of the things why such concepts can be so powerful. And I would like to give a very short structuralist comment on this, because there are structural factors behind this and there are ideational factors behind this. And actually the interplay is the most important thing. Why is it in such a formulation? Why is it becoming so powerful? And actually this interplay is one of the things why you should think about these concepts, because they are making history, right? So the structural factor, just very quickly, whole of Eastern Europe, altogether the Central European parts like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on, they are all amazing out-migrant regions with extremely low fertility, which means that they are having some kind of structural problem of you know, demographic fragility. That is to say, they are facing awful population loss scenarios, and then in order to save, let's say, the social security system of these countries, certain things are to be done, right? So that's one thing, that this is a structural factor. It provides this kind of a fear of population loss, and the fear that they are too fragile in this respect. Now, with this, it would not be enough for a region, right? I'm sure that a lot of people would have paid attention to this, but it would not have become it if it could not be politicized. And that's actually the last point I would like to make, that certain things helped politicians like Viktor Orban to make a whole European political agenda out of the thing, because this could be combined with the idea, and here comes the ideational history, the inferiority of Eastern Europe, and then that is to say, saying that we need to have a new Central Europe which is able to defend itself, its demographic homogeneity, plus it is going to be able to fight against the West, which is trying to impose immigration onto these regions, which they are not going to accept. And then this has been a very powerful message, and then now we can see in all opinion polls, you can see, and this is the hard fact, that let's say the 2016 Eurobarometer shows that when it is about what is the biggest problem of Europe, is it, you know, unemployment, immigration, terrorism, and so on, then all these East European countries very nicely align up, and they say that the biggest problem is immigration, although they are having very low levels of immigration, not to speak about terrorism, which they have never experienced, but they are the harshest to say that that's the biggest problem for Europe. Now, this is why this book is becoming so important for everybody to read, because I think it's going to make history again.
very much. I do believe it was a great presentation. We don't have much time, but just in kind of support of what you're saying and on the political dimension of it, I'm just going to give you 4 different type of formulation where is the divide on migration, and you're going to see that there are 4 different political concepts behind it. If I'm going to tell you that this is a problem between European Union and the Visegrad countries, I'm stressing on the institutional part of it and that it's the government. If I'm going to tell you that it's between the new member states and the old member states, it's very much going to be perceived as migration being part of a transition and enlargement and so on. If I'm going to tell you that it's a East versus West in Europe, I'm much more stressing the ideological part of it. And if I'm going to tell you that it's Central Europe versus Western Europe, it's very much about go to history in order to understand what is going on. And from this point of view, it's not simply the concepts has history, but this history is part of the politicization. You cannot simply use these terms believing that their history does not matter. So what I'm going to suggest the following. Everybody who wants to have a question or make a comment, because we're not going to allow all these people to answer your questions, we are going to have all the comments together, and then basically the editors are going to decide who is going to answer on what. So please. And after that, this was very important. This was the incentive. In order for you to be brief, there is a wine and cheese downstairs.
But only those get to ask a question.
No, and of course, then, yeah, it's 2 questions and then, yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a very good thing that this book clarified the notions of regional. First of all, regional can mean different things in different languages. I think that in German it means something at subnational level. In English, it means more at continental or supranational level. If you take the Organization of the United Nations, you see that there are about 5 regional commissions, Latin America, Africa, Europe, which in fact is North America and former Soviet Union. So I mean, this meaning of regional is very important. Okay, so you have excluded in the book the issue of subnational. Unfortunately, I think it is very important because subnational regions are essential to understand what's going on, and the definition of subnational region has always been a political one. Just think of France during or just after the revolution. You had regions with very distinctive languages and cultures, and then suddenly, in the 19th century, all these languages have been extinguished, and you had no more regions, subnational regions, but départements, which were completely arbitrary. And so on. So what I want to thank is that you addressed this issue of what is a region, but it should be continued.
So you have the next volume planned for you, please.
So first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation and a lot of food for thought. I have not read the book, but I certainly will. I only want to say also that the concept of region is really very rich and very vast. But we have also one organization in Europe which is now encompassing not only Europe but countries beyond, the Council of Europe. And as I have been working at the Council of Europe many years ago, actually when the wall in Berlin fell and the Council of Europe changed for a short time, it seemed to be an important organization, which isn't now. But the Council of Europe at that time already had an organization which was a Council of Municipalities and Regions. And there was also a definition of regions, and the regions, the concept of regions of the Council of Europe is mostly that the recognition that borders separate regions, and they wanted to bring back regions beyond the border, so regional cooperation. And as someone who spent the past 20 years mostly either in Russia or in the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, you know, that a lot from outside, actually actors like the Council of Europe, but also the European Union, try to foster regional cooperation. In the case of Yugoslavia, it means very often the reconstruction of some Yugoslavia in economic terms. CEFTA was mentioned, but there are numerous other organizations trying to reconstruct regions with not so much success, I must honestly say, at least according to my experience. But also there I'm curious to see whether I will find in the book the answers to this concept of regions as it is seen in the perception of people living in regions. For instance, if you take the Dutch, German, Belgium border, there is a region where people speak a similar dialect and language and have similar traditions, religion, etc., or whether region is also something coming from outside, and whether it will have a meaning in the future or not. I'm a little bit skeptical personally.
Thanks again to all the panelists for the very, very interesting presentation. My name is Massi Santini. I'm an economist with the World Bank Group based here in Vienna. I have a very quick question on the relationship between region, the way that has been observed and described by all the panelists, and identity, and whether or not during their research they have seen a direction in this relationship between the region and the formation of identity, or vice versa. Thank you.
Also a very quick question. I was wondering whether you had regions that you were considering including and then finally you omitted. I don't know, East Central Europe or anything like this? And why? I mean, in case there were, why?
I just wanted to come back to the first comment that was made. Thank you very much for the observation. I assure you, in English, as apparently in German, it is a very mixed term. And I would say the essential meaning of it would mean subnational. And traditionally, one has had to talk about world regions. I'm a geographer, so I mean, this is how we've always done. Now, it's not necessarily to do that. But I'd also like to say that in terms of your appeal for a subnational examination, some of the participants in this group are actually putting out a volume now on European regions that are subnational regions. The two editors and a contributor as well is here. So we're doing that. We're following up that as well. That will be out within a year.
So I would like to answer to Zsuzsa, and then Diana will answer to the other two questions, because I think they are related. So I think that's a very interesting and funny question. I think like we had some cases where we had a big discussion. I mean, Great Britain was obviously one. I mean, is it a meso-region in one way or another? I mean, I think the funny thing is that it kind of, while we were doing the book, it became more and more a meso-region, yes? So like from a kind of national space into a kind of supranational space with the kind of articulation of national projects below it. So I think it also shows very nicely that it's moving. And of course, we were having always this dilemma that Iberia basically is quite similar. And Benelux was another issue that we were discussing. Should it make it or should it not? I mean, we even had the feeling that probably Iberia is a little bit below what we are actually looking for. So we were looking for, in a way, bigger entities, but we were a little bit playing with the scales. Like, I mean, like Eastern Europe or Western Europe is obviously a much bigger entity than, let's say, Iberia. But we had a feeling that Iberia also, for example, functions to a certain extent as this kind of supranational region that actually puts together national projects into something bigger. In this respect, Great Britain is probably not so much a meso-region, but I think it's on the way to become Britain. British Isles is going to be some sort of meso-region as well. But about like East Central Europe, for example, like I think it's important, and we didn't mention this, that we were thinking about clusters and also counter concepts. Yeah. So and this is very much, of course, in the tradition of conceptual history, that when we were talking about Balkans, then it's not just the conceptual history of Balkans, it's also the conceptual history of Southeastern Europe. And Zudosta-Europa and all the different national versions, and also the concepts that are somehow adjacent to that. Also, when I wrote the Central European chapter, then of course I talk about East Central Europe, to a certain extent also about Eastern Europe, because sometimes it's actually, these are overlapping concepts, and also about Mitteleuropa, which is not obviously the same as Central Europe, yes, and even about Zwischeneuropa, yes, which is also a idiosyncratic terminology. And we also try to include in every chapter a sub-chapter or a kind of part about the counter concepts. So in what historical moment, what are the counter concepts of certain concepts? So for example, Central Europe's counter concept at some point is Eastern Europe, like in the Kunderayan understanding, but nowadays in the Urbanian Central Europe, it's Western Europe is the counter concept. Yes, so it's also, the notion is the same, but the kind of spacing is different, and then we also try to register this in our chapters.
Yes, and finally, the two questions about the identity and why. Again, it touches upon the issue of subnational and supranational regions, in the sense that what was important for us, and here comes the question of France, for example, and its subnational regions. The real challenge for us that we identified in the supranational regions as compared to subnational regions is that these are formations that have no institutional embedment. In other words, it is not that certain institutions like the national state would obliterate at certain point internal regional differences. You have no such toolkit in the case of the supranational regions. And therefore the question of how do they emerge, survive, become powerful references in different contexts, we found to be extremely important. And here somehow the question of identity is important. And it certainly cannot be asked in terms of which is first identity creating regions or regions creating identity. And one obvious example would be Eastern Europe after the Second World War. As Benjamin Schenk shows in his chapter, Eastern Europe was a region, here is a region of Eastern Europe without East Europeans. Nobody identified as East European, not even the Russians, it turned out, and not even in the official Russian geography, etc., was Eastern Europe actually utilized. So for us, the real question indeed was what made certain regional notions salient, what made other notions being dropped out in certain point, but then resurface again, etc. And that is to follow the whole dynamics and trajectory of this regional terminology, not as a linguistic exercise, but as something that claims to stand for reality, and a serious reality at that, and being endowed with structural components, etc., etc.
Thank you very much. By the way, you are very lucky having such a perceptive external reader. I also read the book. It's a very interesting book, and from this point of view, it's also very interesting because you are not going to read it one night. This is a book to which you go when you're trying to understand certain things. And from this point of view, it's a really useful book, nevertheless, of what kind of a disciplinary study you're doing. So thank you very much for being with us, and the cheese and wine are a region of its own. Welcome.